Okay guys, you want to make sure you have Loctite on these little bearing retaining screws. You definitely want to Loctite those. You don't want them backing off and scraping up on your transmission while it's trying to spin. That would make a mess. So make sure all your bearing retainers are flat and they're seating flatly and correctly. And then this is an irregular shaped case because of the clutch actuation. So when you tap this, you want to get it into a flat spot like that. See how I'm doing that? You don't want to hit it like that. You want to hit it like that. You want to get it nice and flat. Now what I like to do with these old two-strokes is I like to set the bearings in and put the shafts in the cases and torque them down and test the fitment of the transmission before I put the crank in. A lot of times, well in fact every time it should, when you put these cases together, the interference fit of those crank surfaces and those bearings is tight enough that you can't squeeze it together by hand. So there's a lot of drag and there's a lot of resistance there. If you have an alignment problem with the shift forks or the transmission or any of that stuff, you won't feel it because the crank is pressing the cases apart and giving you all that resistance. So you're not going to get an accurate understanding of what's squeezing where and what's not. So what I like to do is fully fit the transmission first. Actually put the cases together and do it dry with no Yamabond so you don't make a mess, and test the transmission fit, and then I resplit the cases and install the crank and do that. But there's no sense putting a crank into a case with Yamabond all over the place if the transmission's not going to fit correctly. So it only takes 5 extra minutes, guys, and it's 5 extra minutes well spent. How often do you split cases? How often are you going to do that? Spend the 5 minutes, get it right. Hey guys, make sure when you test this transmission that you got a nice smooth neutral, and that when you turn the drum you get all 5 gears. The way, or this is a 5-speed or all 6 gears or whatever. Make sure your drum can go all the way from one end of the other and let you watch it work. See, I'm all the way on that end. I'm going to spin it all the way around to here. See, that's your last gear right there. That should be first, where those dogs are engaged right there. And here's neutral. See how neutral one shaft can stay stopped while the other one's spinning.
And also fifth.
That's 5th gear right there. You just want to shift through all those gears and make sure that they're all working before you put this case together, because besides putting the Yamabond in the middle of it, you're also side loading these bearings. These bearings have to be side loaded to put it together the first time. It's impossible not to, the way the seals are made. So you want to side load it one time and leave it together. You don't want to be putting these together and taking them back apart. It's bad for it. So, all right. If you guys want to see how to get these shift forks in and out, they go like this. Once you pull these rods up and move the forks out of the way, you can get the drum lifted in and out. Okay. Once the drum's lifted in and out, you can pull the forks in and out like that. So you put your fork in, put it there, you know, take these forks in and out like that, put them in, put your shift rod in there or your fork rod in, Keep them back away from their home base. You don't want them slid in place yet. Once you get the drum in, then you guide the forks up into their respective troughs and drive those shafts, those pins home. There you go. Drums all the way one way. And now it's all the way the other. You wonder why it's a little bit rough to shift through the gears. Well, it's because these axles are side angling like this. Okay? When you get the other case on there and everything's held perfectly straight, perfectly tight, and everything's oiled up, it'll shift like butter. But right now there's a lot of side play on those axles. So, all right, guys, that's how you do it. I'm gonna go ahead and put the crank in and Yama bond this up, and we'll seal this case. Okay, we got everything cleaned off. I use this brake clean to alcohol to evaporate the gasket surface and get that nice and clean. And that side's still drying. I'm going to go ahead and put the Yama bond on this side. Transmission's installed and tested. I know I got all 5 gears working well and the shafts fit correctly. And I got the crank tapped down in on the left side. So now we're going to go ahead and fit the right side. I like to use Yama bond for this. You guys can use the Honda stuff equally as well. But you want some kind of a non-drying gasket making material down there. You don't want to go to the auto parts store and buy silicone. Please don't do that. It's not going to hold up to the oil and the heat over time. It might seal it for a couple weeks, but it's not going to hold up. So get yourself a good quality Honda bond or Yama bond type material to seal your crankcases with. If you want to be somewhat liberal with the application of this stuff, it's not going to hurt the internals if it gets down inside. There's no oil pump, there's no filter screen, there's no, there's no clogging anything up, there's no pressure fed 4-stroke crank bearing material or pressure fed 4-stroke style crank journals or Babbitt bearings. You don't have any of that. The only oil you have down in this case is what's splashing around on the transmission. So if you go a little bit too far with this stuff and you get it down inside, so what? What you don't want to ever have, what you definitely got to protect yourself from, is any kind of an air leak. Any kind of an air leak whatsoever on a 2-stroke. Lean your jetting out and blow you up quick. Because, of course, it gets hotter. You ever hear those guys at the track say, man, my bike was running so good, and then all of a sudden it blew up? Yeah, well, crank bearings probably got loose, letting the crank move in the orifice of the case, warbling out the seals, and developing air leaks. So you really got to watch that with the 2-strokes, guys. Absolutely critical that you're not leaking any air. Okay. I took that screwdriver and worked that web down in between. See how I work that area through there? Okay. And if you get a little bit on the crank, it's just going to dry up and make a mess. If it falls off and gets up between the piston and the cylinder wall, it's not going to eat anything. It's just going to grind down to little pulverized bits of rubber and go out the exhaust. So you really can't hurt much with Yama bond. Now you see these holes where I filled up the orifices? I go back and do what I'm doing here. See what I'm doing there? It's not really a big deal, but it just keeps excess spooge from filling up your threads. If you get a whole lot of Yama bond behind a thread, I mean, you got to get a lot back there. If you get a whole lot behind a thread, you can actually bust an aluminum case, because when you crank the screw in to that female, if that screw is long enough and you pack that orifice full of a non-compressible liquid like oil or water or Yama bond, you'll blow the aluminum out of the other side of the case, torquing the bolt down. So it's pretty rare. It's not a big deal. Doesn't happen often. But I do like to go through with a screwdriver and poke all the Yamabond out of the way and make nice bolt holes, just like I did just there. And then you just hold your camera in your mouth and take your rag and wipe your screwdriver off. And if you get the Yamabond off the tool while it's still wet, it won't stick. You can wipe it off with the rag when it's still wet, so you won't mess your tools all up. Okay, I'm going to let the alcohol and brake clean on this side of the case dry a little more before I tack it down and press it, because once I do tack it down and press it, if that liquid alcohol is still wet, it will it'll dilute the sealant before it grips the metal. It's pretty dry. I don't see any dripping off. Yeah, okay, it's already dry, so here we go. See how I wet that seal? I wet that seal so we didn't get any seal damage or tears. Okay, so I got to the point where the crank is holding it and resisting it because this side doesn't want to go in the bearing. Do not hit these with hammers. I've seen a lot of guys go like this on this part of the case and hit these with even metal hammers, which is extra horrible. Do not pound on the case like that. Get yourself a block of wood or real long bolts. The most appropriate way to do this is take real long bolts like this and pull the case through evenly and work it around evenly until you press this in. I like the block of wood method just because I don't have a bunch of super long bolts laying around and it's pretty easy. So I'm going to take this block of wood and tap it down right there until I get that case sealed. And I can't do that while I'm holding the camera, so I'll be back in a minute.